There is a particular quality to the silence of Lake Baikal in summer. Not the comfortable silence of a calm evening. Something older than that. Something that predates the Russian language, predates the Cossack surveyors who first mapped the lake's edge in 1643, predates the Trans-Siberian Railway that eventually cut along its southern shore like a steel scar. The Buryat people, the indigenous community who have fished and preyed along these shores for millennia, have a word for it. They say the lake is not silent at all. They say it is listening. Lake Baikal is the world's deepest freshwater body. 1.6 kilometers from surface to lake bed. Over 25 million years old. It holds roughly 20% of all the unfrozen fresh water on Earth. By volume, it is not a lake. It is an inland sea, ancient and largely unexplored, tucked into the southern rim of Siberia near the Mongolian border. Its waters are so clear that in summer you can see 40 meters into the depths below your boat. And still, the bottom remains invisible. The Buryat shamans, known as Bu, have maintained for centuries that something lives in those depths. Not a fish. Not a geological anomaly. Something with intention. They call it the spirit master of the waters. A sovereign of the lower world. A force that governs what enters the lake, and decides what is allowed to leave. In the summer of 1982, the Soviet military sent a training unit of naval frogmen to Lake Baikal. The official record designates the operation as a routine deep-water equipment evaluation, standard procedure for preparing combat divers for Arctic deployment. The men who descended into that water call it something else entirely. What you are about to hear is reconstructed from declassified naval archive fragments, oral testimony from retired Soviet military personnel, and the internal bulletin issued by the USSR Ministry of Defense engineer forces in the months following the incident. The ministry's own documents do not use the word unexplained. They use the phrase anomalous contact. The distinction matters. If you value real-world mysteries recovered from the fringes of conflict, stay with me. To understand what happened in the summer of 1982, you need to understand two things: the lake and the military moment. Lake Baikal sits at the southern edge of Siberia, roughly 70 kilometers north of the Mongolian frontier. It stretches over 600 kilometers in length. Its basin was formed by tectonic rifting, the same geological violence that created the East African Rift, and it continues to widen by approximately 2 centimeters per year. Geologists believe that in geological time, it is becoming an ocean. For now, it is a wound in the Earth's crust filled with water that is, by most measures, the purest on the planet. Over 4,000 species of plant and animal life have been cataloged in and around Baikal. 70% of them exist nowhere else on Earth. The lake has its own seal species, the Nerpa, the only exclusively freshwater seal in the world, and no one has satisfactorily explained how it got there. Hydrothermal vents in the lake bed pump heat and mineral-rich water into the system, creating microecosystems at crushing depths. There are places in Lake Baikal where light has never reached, where pressure would flatten an unprotected human body in seconds. The Soviet military knew all of this. That is exactly why they trained there. By 1982, the Soviet Union was at the height of its Cold War posture. Leonid Brezhnev had died in November of that year. The regime was transitioning, but the military apparatus was still operating at full institutional momentum. The Afghan war was grinding through its third year. The naval arm of the Soviet military was locked in a continuous, silent contest with the United States Navy for dominance of the world's deep waters. Combat diver units, the frogmen, were a specialized and elite component of that competition. They trained in conditions designed to simulate the worst the ocean could produce: extreme cold, low visibility, disorienting pressure, equipment failure. Lake Baikal offered all of these in abundance, without the logistical complexity of a coastal deployment. A naval training facility had been established on the lake's western shore. The exact location remains partially redacted in available documents. What is confirmed is that in the summer of 1982, a unit of 7 trained combat divers, their commanding officer designated in fragmentary records only as Senior Lieutenant V, was dispatched to the facility for a series of deep water equipment evaluations. The divers arrived in early July. The air smelled of pine resin and diesel fuel from the generator lines strung along the camp perimeter. At night, the lake was completely dark. The far shore was invisible. When you stood at the water's edge after sundown, the sound of the lake was a low, continuous frequency, not waves exactly, more like respiration. Several of the divers noted this in the days before the first dive. One, a Ukrainian sailor named Petro Lysenko, who gave an interview to a journalist in Kiev in 1994, described standing at the dock on their second night at the facility. "I have dived in the Black Sea. I have dived in the Baltic. I have been in water where you cannot see your own hand. But there was something about standing at the edge of that lake at night, the feeling that the water was aware of you. I told myself it was the altitude. I told myself it was the isolation. I have spent many years since then trying to find a better explanation. He has not found one." The first dive of the evaluation occurred on the morning of July 14, 1982. The team descended to approximately 50 meters, roughly 160 feet, along the western shelf of the lake's basin. The objective was to test a new iteration of Soviet closed-circuit rebreather equipment under sustained operational conditions. Standard parameters. Nothing irregular in the briefing. What follows is reconstructed from the post-incident account given by Senior Lieutenant V to his immediate superior, and later preserved in a fragmentary internal report. The account was corroborated by at least 2 additional members of the dive team. In the voice of the soldier himself, "We were at depth for approximately 20 minutes when Kovalenko signaled. The standard hand gesture for look left. I turned. At first I thought it was a thermal layer. The water does strange things when temperature gradients cross. You get visual distortion like looking through glass that isn't quite flat. But this was not a thermal layer. There were 3 of them. They were moving parallel to us, approximately 15 meters to our left at the same depth. They were human-shaped. Tall, significantly taller than any of us. I would estimate close to 3 meters. They wore suits that appeared metallic in the light of our torches, very tight against the body. Their movements were efficient. That is the word I keep returning to. Not natural, not mechanical. Efficient. Like something that had been optimized for that environment over a very long time. None of them carried rebreather equipment. No tanks. No regulators. No propulsion gear. At 50 meters, in water that was just above freezing, they needed nothing. They moved without effort. The helmets were spherical, smooth. No visible seam or visor. I signaled the team, hold position. Nobody moved. We hung there in the water for what I estimate was 45 seconds. It felt considerably longer, and the 3 figures maintained their parallel course. They did not look at us. Or perhaps they could not look at us in any way we could recognize. And then they descended. Straight down. Into the dark. They were gone inside of 10 seconds. When we surfaced, I reported a possible equipment malfunction. I said we had experienced visual distortion at depth. I used that word, distortion. I filed it as a potential nitrogen narcosis event, even though we were well within the safety margins and none of us had any of the other symptoms. I filed it that way because I did not know what else to say. The dive team returned to the facility. They ate their evening meal, cold tinned meat, black bread, tea from the samovar that was always slightly too bitter. Nobody spoke about what had happened underwater. This is a pattern that would repeat. That night, the radio at the facility produced an anomalous transmission. The duty operator, a conscript named Fedorov, logged it as interference before calling for the senior lieutenant.
November 7, this is base. Sit rep on your position, over. Base, we are receiving you broken. Possible atmospheric interference. Request you repeat, over. I'm logging this as interference. I'm logging this.
The senior lieutenant listened to the recording twice. He instructed Fedorov to note it as an equipment issue and to say nothing to the rest of the team. Fedorov, who was 19 years old and 6 months into his mandatory service, agreed immediately. He kept his word for 9 years. He broke it in 1991, in the weeks after the Soviet Union officially dissolved, when a retired naval officer named Vladimir Azaza began collecting testimonies from former personnel of the Baikal facility. By then there was more to tell. The fragments encounter on July 14th was not an isolated event. This is the detail that separates the Baikal incident from the vast catalog of individual anomalous reports that accumulated within Soviet military files during the Cold War. What happened in the summer of 1982 was consistent. 3 days after the initial sighting, a second dive was conducted. The team's composition was slightly different. One diver had reported a mild respiratory issue and was stood down. The remaining 6 descended to approximately 45 meters along a slightly different azimuth from the first dive location. At depth, they again encountered anomalous contacts. This time, the figures were seen at a greater distance and did not maintain a parallel course. They appeared to be ascending from below. The dive team's torches illuminated them only briefly, enough to confirm the same physical profile described in the first encounter. Tall, metallic suits, spherical helmets, no apparent breathing apparatus. One diver, according to the internal report, attempted to approach the figures. He was pulled back by Kovalenko. The figures continued their ascent and passed through the team's position approximately 10 meters to the east, moving upward at a consistent speed. They did not surface. The team's decompression stop was at 15 meters. They held position there for 7 minutes. Nothing appeared above them. Whatever had ascended from the deep did not breach the surface. At least not anywhere visible. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. In the late 1980s, as the USSR began its slow dissolution and military personnel began speaking with greater freedom, a collection of accounts emerged from the Trans-Baikal and West Siberian military regions, not from divers, but from surface personnel who had conducted separate training exercises in and around the lake during different years. A signals operator who served at a different installation along the lake's northern shore described a period in the winter of 1979, 3 years before the Frogman's summer deployment, when his unit experienced a recurring phenomenon. Each night for approximately 10 days, at a consistent time between 2 and 4 in the morning, their radio equipment produced interference of a specific character. Not static. Not the typical pop and hiss of atmospheric disruption. A rhythmic pulse. 7 beats. Pause. 7 beats. He had not spoken to anyone from the 1982 facility. He did not know about Fedorov's log. He described the same sequence independently, in a different year from a different position on the lake. When this was pointed out to him during the collection of his testimony, he was quiet for a long moment. 7, he said finally. The lake is 25 million years old and it keeps counting to 7. I do not know what that means. I am not sure I want to. The Buryat people did not need the Soviet military to tell them that Lake Baikal contained something unusual. Buryat cosmology divides existence into 3 interconnected realms. The upper world of celestial deities, the middle world of humans and animals, and the lower world, the dark, chaotic domain of spirits that govern the depths. Lake Baikal in this framework is not simply a body of water. It is a threshold, a place where the membrane between the middle world and the lower world is thin. The spirit master of the lake, the presiding deity of Baikal in Buryat tradition, is described as neither benevolent nor malevolent in the simple sense. It is sovereign. It enforces boundaries. Those who approach the lake with what the Buryat call an unclean soul, meaning those who come with aggression, with extraction, with disregard, are said to be taken. Not punished, taken. As if the lake simply decides to keep them. The creature known in Buryat tradition as Lusud Khan, translated as Water Dragon Master, is described in oral accounts going back centuries. Not a monster in the Western sense. Something more architectural. An entity that is part of the lake's structure, the way a foundation is part of a building. Ancient petroglyphs found along the Baikal cliffs depict elongated figures in the water, figures that rise and descend vertically, figures that appear to be encased in some form of shell or casing. These carvings predate the Soviet military by several thousand years. When retired Colonel Vladimir Azaza, former Soviet submariner and later a researcher who spent years collecting Baikal accounts, showed photographs of the petroglyphs to Fedorov, the radio operator who had logged the 7-pulse transmission in 1982, Fedorov reportedly stared at the images for a considerable time without speaking. Then he said, "I want to note, for whatever record you are keeping, that I am an atheist and a trained signals technician. I have spent my entire adult life looking for rational explanations for what I experienced at that lake." He paused. "I have not found one that accounts for all of it. It would be convenient if the anomalies at Baikal were purely visual, the product of cold, depth, disorientation, or the particular psychological pressure of isolated military deployment in Siberia. Convenient but incomplete." In the weeks following the July dives, the training facility's technical personnel documented a series of equipment malfunctions that were logged separately from the dive reports, and only later, when researchers began assembling the full picture, understood to form a coherent timeline. The facility's sonar equipment, passive hydrophones designed to detect underwater movement, began producing anomalous readings within 48 hours of the first fragment sighting. The readings did not correspond to any known biological signature in the lake. They described objects of significant mass moving at speeds inconsistent with any documented aquatic creature or known submersible technology. The objects, if that is what they were, changed depth rapidly, dropping from 50 meters to over 400 meters in intervals too short to calculate precisely with the equipment available. The Geiger counters at the facility registered no elevated radiation. The water temperature sensors showed no anomalous thermal activity. The visual anomalies were below the surface. The sonar anomalies were real and measurable, and they had no explanation that the facility's technical officer was prepared to put in writing. He wrote, "Equipment calibration recommended," in his log and said nothing further. What happened next is the part of this account that the Soviet Ministry of Defense worked hardest to suppress. Not because it was the most extraordinary thing that occurred at Baikal in the summer of 1982, but because it was the most costly. The decision was made, and this is confirmed by the internal reprimand later issued by Major General V. Demienko, commander of the USSR Military Diver Service, that the unit would attempt to capture one of the entities. Read that sentence again. The Soviet military command, upon receiving reports of unidentified humanoid figures at depth in Lake Baikal, determined that the correct response was an apprehension operation. This tells you something about the institutional psychology of Cold War Soviet military leadership. The unknown was not a thing to retreat from. It was a thing to classify, contain, and control. On the morning of the operation, a date redacted in available documents but estimated from context to be late July 1982, all 7 members of the dive team descended together, equipped with a large capture net in addition to their standard gear. The net was designed for use in maritime special operations. It was rated for significant tensile force. Senior Lieutenant V led the descent. They reached 50 meters. They held position and waited. They did not wait long. What happened in the next several minutes is described with remarkable consistency across the accounts of the surviving divers, accounting for the obvious distortions of trauma and the natural variation in human perception of fast-moving events under extreme conditions. The figures appeared, not 3 this time but more. Estimates range from 5 to 8. They came from below, ascending rapidly, and they did not maintain their previous parallel distance. They came directly toward the team. The net was deployed. Senior Lieutenant V signaled the advance. What followed was described by one surviving diver as a concussion of water. Not a pressure wave in the physical sense. Something that behaved like a shockwave but left no measurable signature on the pressure gauges the team carried. A force, spherical in shape by all accounts, that emanated from the assembled figures and expanded outward. All 7 divers were driven to the surface, at depth, moving upward at that speed, without a controlled ascent, without decompression stops. 3 of the 7 did not survive. 2 died within hours from decompression sickness, nitrogen bubbles in the blood, in the joints, in the brain, the condition known colloquially as the bends. A 3rd died 3 days later from complications. The 4 survivors were left with permanent disabilities of varying severity. Their service records list the cause of injury as rapid decompression caused by equipment malfunction. There was no equipment malfunction. The gear was examined afterward and found to be fully functional. A decompression chamber was rushed to the facility. Major General Demienko himself was flown in, not to investigate the incident, but to issue a direct order to surviving personnel at other training facilities along the lake and in the West Siberian military region. The order was explicit: do not attempt to approach or capture the entities. Do not attempt to net them, contain them, or interact with them in any directive way. The order assumed they would be encountered again. The order was not a response to an isolated event. It was a policy directive. Shortly afterward, the engineer forces of the Ministry of Defense issued a classified bulletin, restricted to a very limited circle of senior officers, that listed numerous deep-water lakes across Soviet territory where similar phenomena had been reported. Lake Issyk-Kul, the Saras Lake in the Pamir Range, several unnamed reservoirs in Turkmenistan and the West Siberian military region. The bulletin noted aquatic anomalies of an analogous type at each location. It noted the surfacing and submersion of disc-shaped and spherical objects emitting significant luminescence. The stated purpose of the bulletin in its own language was, and this is the phrase that appears in the document as translated and preserved by researchers, to prevent unnecessary encounters. Not to investigate, not to understand, to prevent further contact. The files from the 1982 Baikal operation were classified within the Soviet Naval Archive. In the chaos of the USSR's dissolution between 1989 and 1991, portions of the KGB's intelligence apparatus were transferred, some to the new Russian Federation, some reportedly to Western intelligence agencies, some simply lost. The Baikal naval files were among the latter category. What exists in the public record now are fragments: Demienko's reprimand, portions of the ministry bulletin, the testimonies collected by Azaza in the early 1990s, and the accounts of individual soldiers who chose to speak after the government that had ordered their silence ceased to exist. The lake itself kept no file. It has no obligation to explain itself. In 1958, 24 years before the fragments deployment, a Russian hydrographic survey vessel operating on Lake Baikal documented a silver disk entering the water vertically at high speed. No sonic boom. No debris field. The crew logged it, submitted the report, and never received a response from the relevant authority. In the mid-1980s, fishermen working the ice on Baikal's northern shore described watching Soviet military divers being thrown clear of the water, ascending 15, 20, 30 feet above the surface before falling back. The fishermen assumed they were witnessing some new form of military training exercise. They had not heard about 1982. They could not have. They were simply reporting what they saw. Across multiple decades, across different seasons and different witnesses with no connection to one another, the lake produced the same account. Something in the depths, moving with purpose. Something that did not wish to be caught. The Buryat shamans could have told the military this from the beginning. They were not asked. There are several ways to hold what happened at Lake Baikal in 1982. The rational framework, the one the Soviet military ultimately settled on after a fashion, is that extreme cold, pressure narcosis, and the psychological stress of isolated deployment in an alien environment can produce shared hallucinations among close-knit units. It is a documented phenomenon. Combat and extreme conditions alter perception in ways that are individually difficult to detect and collectively easy to reinforce. Three men who undergo the same trauma will, over time, construct a coherent shared memory that may not correspond precisely to physical reality. This explanation accounts for the visual encounters. It does not account for the sonar readings. It does not account for the ministry bulletin that listed analogous phenomena across 12 separate locations. It does not account for the signals operator in 1979, 3 years prior, at a different installation, logging the same 7-pulse transmission with no knowledge of the 1982 events. It does not account for the fishermen who watched divers break the surface at impossible height. The rational framework is not wrong exactly. It is simply insufficient. There is another way to hold this, and it is the way the Buryat tradition has always held it, that certain places on this earth are not neutral. That Lake Baikal, 25 million years old, deeper than most of human civilization is old, teeming with life found nowhere else on the planet, is not simply a geological feature. It is a domain, and like all domains, it has a sovereign. Whether that sovereign is biological, geological, or something that does not fit neatly into either category is a question that the available evidence cannot answer. What the evidence does answer, quietly without drama, is this. The Soviet military, one of the most powerful and most secretive institutional forces of the 20th century, descended into Lake Baikal with nets and orders and the full weight of state authority behind them. The lake sent them back. 3 of them did not come back at all. War, and the Cold War was a war fought without declared battlefields but with genuine casualties, has a way of stripping the layers of ordinary assumption from the world. When you have removed comfort, removed routine, removed the noise of peacetime civilization, what remains is something older. Something that was present before the categories we use to sort experience into real and imagined were developed. The men who went into that water were trained professionals. They were not credulous. They were not given to fantasy. They were the product of a state apparatus that was deeply institutionally skeptical of anything it could not measure and control. And yet, Senior Lieutenant V, whose full name was never confirmed in available documents, reportedly did not return to active diving service after the summer of 1982. He was transferred to an administrative role. The nature of the transfer is described in fragmentary records as voluntary reassignment following operational stress. Fedorov, the radio operator, completed his mandatory service and returned to civilian life in Ukraine. He trained as an electrician. He raised a family. He did not speak about the summer of 1982 until the Soviet Union was gone. When he finally did speak, he was careful and precise as a trained technician would be. He described the 7-pulse transmission one final time for the researcher collecting his testimony. He described listening to it in real time, the static, the pause, the counted pulses. "I have thought about it for 9 years," he said. "My conclusion is this. Whatever was counting, it knew we were there. It was not a malfunction. Malfunctions are random. This was addressed." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Lake Baikal is still there. Still the deepest freshwater body on Earth. Still 25 million years old, still widening by 2 centimeters per year, still filled with species that exist nowhere else. The Buryat community still conduct their rituals at Shaman Rock on Alkan Island, still make offerings to the spirit master of the waters, still treat the lake as something that deserves more than utilitarian respect. The Soviet naval facility on the western shore has long since been decommissioned. Its buildings have been reclaimed by the taiga. The generator lines are gone. The dock where the frogmen prepared their equipment on those July mornings has rotted back into the water. The water is unchanged. It is still listening. War creates many ghosts, but not all of them are human. And not all of them are recent. If this investigation reached you, subscribe. More records exist. More files remain. We will continue to look.